Hi everybody, welcome to Two Out the First. It is May the 12th, 2023. I'm Ryan Ballantyne. It's good to have you here with us. We are presented by our friends at Swanee's Golf. If you're watching the show, I'm wearing a lovely Swanee's Golf polo. Played golf today in it. Look great, feel great. Made an eagle in a hole I haven't eagled in 5 years, 6 years, something like that. So it's a lovely day, and I'm going to say the clothes had something to do with it. So check them out at Swanee's Golf, and you can find them online at a bunch of different retailers as well. But we'll talk more about them in the coming weeks and months. And we have 110 days until I'm going to Ireland to cover the Horizon Irish Open and go take a tour of Irish golf. I'm so excited. I haven't been basically since just before my wife and I became parents a little over 10 years ago. So it's going to be awesome. Can't wait. 110 days to go. We'll do a little countdown clock somewhere over here probably in the weeks to go once we get under 100 days. But we have a lot to talk about that's not related to me. We've got plenty of things to talk about related to legal action or sanctions from the DP World Tour. They finally came out with everything in the arsenal this week, and holy moly, it's a lot. Talk about that. Talk about some changes to the LIV golfers lawsuit against the PGA Tour. It's pretty substantial, and we'll talk about what I think that might mean. And then we're going to talk about a couple of things related to women's golf. One in the NCAAs that I think is abhorrent and is really got my blood boiling, and we'll talk about that on the back half. And then a cool story with Nelly Korda this week at the Cognizant Founders Cup. So let's start at the beginning with the DP World Tour and the LIV Golf versus PGA Tour lawsuit. These things are somewhat connected, so we'll call them one single topic. But we talked about this a little bit, I think, toward the beginning of the week, and then a little bit last week even. From the DP World Tour's perspective, they finally had the clearance after an arbitration panel ruled in their favor last month that they could issue sanctions on players, current members or otherwise, LIV players, permanent or otherwise, relating to these players choosing to compete not only in the first LIV Golf event last June just outside of London, but in subsequent ones. And they announced some sanctions, 100,000 pound fines to players who went and played, 17 of them, in these events, this first event. And that 16 of them had paid the 100,000 pound fine. The one who didn't was Sergio Garcia, and there's still perhaps a legal remedy to that to come. But that 4 players, Garcia, Richard Bland, Ian Poulter, and Lee Westwood, all resigned their membership and after paying the fine, except for Garcia, who did not. And that was stage one. Here are the guys who are resigning their membership. Then, thank you for your service to the Ryder Cup, everybody but Richard Bland. Then, next stage, here are the fines for the 17 players, the ones that went to LIV on a contractual permanent basis, the ones that maybe played 2 or 3 events and then came back. That's what their fine was for making that first step to break the rules. And now, here's the last, presumably last, maybe there's more, step from the DP World Tour that came out on Thursday. I was doing a site visit for a video yesterday, so we didn't get to do this. But this is really an escalation of that 100,000 pound fine, and it relates to players who, in the DP World Tour's words, breached the tour's conflicting tournament regulation by competing in LIV Golf and Asian Tour events without releases to do so. And the events that these announced sanctions cover the period from June 22nd, 2022, basically the start of LIV, the day before this panel was created from sport resolutions to handle the matter because of this issue for the first LIV event and then wanting to play in the Genesis Scottish Open that basically right after that, all the way through to April 2nd, 2023, so just before the Masters, the Orlando event on LIV. And that includes the first 2 LIV events that were played, including the Centurion Club one and then the one at Pumpkin Ridge in Oregon. And that's a part of this matter as well, kind of maybe even a little bit separate because those were like the first incursions. And then obviously players signed with LIV, they kept playing, stuff like that. So the DP World Tour says that decision determined from the sport resolutions people that the DP World Tour had acted, quote, entirely reasonably in refusing releases, end quote, for those events and that the conflicting tournament regulation was, quote, reasonable and proportionate to the tour's continued operation as a professional golf tour, end quote. And then they go and cite further stuff from this panel report that they had a, quote, legitimate and justifiable interest, end quote, in enforcing their own regulations and the imposition of sanctions, including fines and suspensions. With all that said, in total on Thursday, 26 players were informed individually of sanctions applicable to them on an individual basis based on specific conflicting tournaments they played in as a DP World Tour member without being granted a release. So there's a wide variety of players covered under that. A lot of different DP World Tour members played some LIV event last year, whether that was the first one or a one-off or 2 or 3 or 6 or 7 or all 8 or they're still there. Wide swath of potential outcomes here, right? So the individuals were assessed based on what they did and when they did it and probably how much money they got out of it, to be honest with you. And the release continues. These sanctions include fines and, where appropriate, tournament suspensions. The sanctions imposed were determined on a case-by-case basis, as we mentioned, acknowledging differences between the events in terms of the impact on the DP World Tour's broadcast partners, sponsors, and stakeholders. And all of that is to say the difference between Lee Westwood, Ian Poulter, and Sergio Garcia, Henrik Stenson, Martin Keimer, and Graham McDowell, all Ryder Cuppers of note, major winners, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, that the impact of their playing LIV events or Asian Tour events without release, as opposed to, no offense to Adri Arnas or Adrian Otegi, someone like that who's a great player but isn't necessarily the same star caliber. That obviously has a different impact on the DP World Tour's partners and the DP World Tour itself. So they said, where fines were issued to players, they ranged from £12,500 to £100,000 for each individual breach of the conflicting tournament regulation. So think about it this way. If you competed on LIV last year in all 8 tournaments, and you competed in all 8 tournaments without the permission of the DP World Tour, right? And then you played in the, 5 events? 4 events, I think, leading into the Masters. That's 12 events. So if you are an upper tier, big name player, conceptually, they don't divulge these fine totals for every player, but conceptually, you could probably have been fined over £1 million. As many as, if I'm thinking about it right, £1.2 million. That's a lot of money. And if you convert that into dollars, even at the depressed rate that the British pound is going for these days, that's well over $1.5 million. Well, just about $1.5 million. Pretty amazing. That's a big, big fine if you're at that level. But if you're a player who, frankly, is lesser known or occasionally competes on the DP World Tour, something like that, well, maybe you're getting that $12,500 fine 4 or 5 times and that costs you £50,000. Well, that's different because your impact on the DP World Tour's business is frankly different. So that's where they came up with that. And we're not done, because now we get to the suspension part of this that's really fascinating. The total cumulative suspension imposed on any single player for breaches in the period of June 22nd last year to April 2nd this year is a maximum of 8 DP World Tour tournaments, comprising a combination of 1 or 2 week suspensions. The suspensions imposed relate to regular season DP World Tour events, so those that are not major championships, and I guess the WGC, but they didn't have an event opposite that, and will run consecutively, effective from the Porsche European Open from June 1st through 4th, and will remain in chronological order until it's done. So they'll take these suspensions and give them basically 1 and 2 week periods where players can't compete in regular DP World Tour events. The majors, they obviously can't, they don't handle, they don't have any say in that. And that'll continue effectively for 2 months, June and July. And then it'll get into August a little bit because you'll have the US Open, the Open Championship, both those things the DP World Tour doesn't control. So if you got the full 8 tournament suspension, I mean, you're into sometime in August, I suppose, depending on what you did. And that's going to lead to some players resigning their membership. Henrik Stenson's already kind of mentioned it. I think he's kind of out the door. I would assume the same thing is going to happen for some of the other players that haven't already resigned. They're either going to try to avoid paying this, which that could create some other legal problems for them, or they're going to try to negotiate their way out. I don't know. And we also don't know the length of contract for all of these players that were DP World Tour regulars that have signed with LIV. And the rumor that has gone around, and some reporting of this has been made public, but most people believe that players who have signed with LIV have done so for 3, 4, and 5 years. That was my operating assumption for the better players, for the bigger names. But that may not be true for every player. We don't know their contract. It might be 2 seasons. And if they're done after this year and they don't play well enough to avoid a relegation component of LIV, which they do have, I think the top 24 players get to stay, and then the players who are contractually in the system, they get to stay regardless. So there's going to be some potential turnover in LIV for next year. And if you're out of a contract, do you pay this fine and you walk out on LIV? Or do you choose to stay in that ecosystem and try to chase your way back to LIV through the International Series, through the Asian Tour? They're going to have some kind of Q school type thing. We haven't heard all about that yet, but they've said they're going to do that. Do you chase that way and you just pay the fine and eat it in the hopes that or as kind of a backup plan, thinking, well, if I don't stay on LIV, at least I'd have a place to play, because for a lot of these players, going back to the PGA Tour is not going to be something easily accomplished. They're either going to have to go to Q school or play the Korn Ferry Tour or try to get exemptions or Monday qualifiers. Like, you're not going to have full status, which means if you don't have full status, it's really hard to get on the PGA Tour. Really hard. So as DP World Tour life honorary members in many of these cases, maybe you need to pay the fine just in case you want to play some more golf when you're done with LIV. Or if LIV goes away, then that's another thing to consider. So I'm interested to see what will come of this announcement from Thursday. I'm sure there will be another one to either talk about actions against people like Sergio Garcia, who have refused to pay the fine to this point, even though LIV has said they're willing to pay it on their behalf, or do they pay it and then they announce that's been paid because they've already announced the ones that have been paid? Did they say the amount? Oh, there's a lot of intrigue to this to me. But they're putting down the hammer here at the DP World Tour, and they know they're in the right legally, or at least from an arbitration standpoint, so they feel completely willing to stick it to some of these players, and we don't know who's going to get stuck to the most, but that they've come up with this pretty sizable range of fines, basically 1/8 to a full fine of 100,000. That's saying something. Saying something. It's crazy where we're at in this right now. And you would have thought that if these players had just said, look, we took the money, going to resign our membership. If we can negotiate something where we could come back later if LIV goes away, we'd totally like to do that. Let's keep the door open. Don't burn the bridge. And instead, they lit it with gasoline, and then the DP World Tour came and lit the match. So here we are. How exciting. Sort of a second topic, but sort of related to this, and we'll see where this leads us, and maybe we don't get very much past this topic, but I do want to try to keep this fairly short. Second story, we'll probably do 3 altogether, given where we're at in the show. But now there are no players that have attached their names as plaintiffs in the lawsuit, antitrust lawsuit, where LIV is now the lead plaintiff, LIV Golf Corporate, versus the PGA Tour. The final 2 players, Bryson DeChambeau and Matt Jones, have withdrawn their names from the lawsuit. So of the 11 players that originally filed this lawsuit last August in the U.S. District Court in Northern California, they are all gone. Peter Uihlein dropped last week, and now you've got Bryson and Matt Jones dropping it. So Golf Week was the first to report this, at least on some kind of digital print. John Nucci, who talks about this in his Twitter feed, and is great. He's an attorney by trade, so he really understands this stuff and gives some great insight to the proceedings here. I think he probably had this around the same time, but regardless, Golf Week had it as a full story first. And apparently, DeChambeau's manager is named Brett Falkoff, who's played in like LIV Golf Pro-Ams and stuff, did confirm that decision and did send some kind of text message to Golf Week saying, quote, Bryson has made the decision to remove himself from the ongoing litigation between LIV Golf and the PGA Tour. Bryson wants to solely focus on competing at the highest level week in and week out. He will continue to support the growth of golf and its expansion on a global scale, contributing both on and off the course as a positive influence on the game. End quote. I don't know what any of that means or what any of that has to do with the lawsuit, but he's out. And then Matt Jones gave a much less interesting and much more curt response to golfchannel.com and or golfweek.com, excuse me. Golfchannel.com confirmed this as well, which, I mean, you just read by legal documents. And if you're ever interested in this, contact me. Ryan at thegolfnewsnet.com, on Twitter at Ryan Ballingy. I'll show you how to set up a Pacer account. You can read all of this stuff yourself. I just kind of bring it to you as it interests me, and reporters do the same, but you can do the digging yourself. Anyhow, golfweek.com or Golfweek did get a hold of Matt Jones and asked him why he withdrew from the lawsuit, and he said, quote, no reason at all, end quote, which is definitely not true. You don't just do that for no apparent reason. But the real point of this is that LIV Golf is the lead plaintiff in the lawsuit. And so the belief here among the players is that if they withdraw their name from the lawsuit, they may not be able to be deposed as part of discovery, which that definitely isn't legally true. So there is still a realistic possibility that if this thing keeps going, and right now we're at this kind of meandering part where the Saudi Public Investment Fund and LIV Golf are trying very hard to either keep the proceedings moving or to delay or somehow impact the deposition of Saudi PIF members, the head, Al Rumayyan. And if they can do that, then maybe that buys them some time, and they want to continue the proceeding. In the meanwhile, the judge in this case has been reluctant to do that, but we'll see where that leaves us. Even still, there's a very realistic possibility that a couple of things happen. One, that the PGA Tour gets their way and gets to depose the Public Investment Fund. And if they get to do that, they can have access to all kinds of information, documents, testimony, other stuff that, frankly, the Saudis don't want out in public. Not just about LIV, but their other investments. And then you've got the realistic possibility the PGA Tour could still say, but you attached your name to this lawsuit, you 11 players. We are going to try to depose each and every one of you for sticking your name on it in the first place. And they probably got good reason to do so, which means now you've got to get them on tape. You try it. That stuff probably comes out in public in some fashion or another. And all of a sudden, a whole lot of information about players' back-channel dealings with LIV and how they got their contracts signed and all that stuff, that becomes public. That could potentially be embarrassing. So there is a realistic possibility that this never gets to trial. And by the way, it is currently scheduled for May 2024. It could go into 2025. It also could end tomorrow. I could see a very realistic set of outcomes here, which include LIV just saying, you know what, this isn't worth it once they get to the point that they've exhausted all of their delays and challenges to try to avoid deposition and discovery. And then they say, you know what, it's not worth it. We're out the door. And that could just be because of the lawsuit. That could be because our business model's not worth it. Whatever the reason. I'm not going to speculate on that. It could be any reason to withdraw from the lawsuit, but they've got several reasons why. So now that this is purely LIV Golf versus the PGA Tour, it is a little bit clearer from a legal perspective, but that doesn't really change what was going on here. So it's a very interesting case, and there hasn't been a whole lot of movement on it lately because of kind of legal maneuvering between both sides, but that's where we stand right now, and now there are no players involved, and we'll see what that leads to next. One last thing I want to talk about here, and it doesn't require a whole lot of time, but it got my blood boiling yesterday, and Brentley Romine, who works at golfchannel.com, shared this story with video from the NCAA Division III Women's Golf Championship. The third round was canceled yesterday, and almost 60% of the 151-player field didn't complete play. And the reason they didn't complete play is because the course was Mission Inn, El Campeon, which is in Howey in the Hills, Florida. Played it. I've really enjoyed the course before. The resort I quite like a lot. It's really fun to be there. So I'm not going to pile on the resort at all. But El Campeon has hosted a whole lot of tournaments. It hosts an Epson Tour event. It's hosted plenty of USGA qualifiers, state AMs, all those types of things. They know what they're doing. But apparently a hole location on the 6th hole, which is played 308 yards for these players, the hole location was so severe that it was kind of on an upslope, and if the ball didn't go in the cup, it came back at you hard, like basically back to your feet. And player after player after player found this 5% slope portion on the right side of the green and just constantly were 3, 4, 5, 6 putting, and it really slowed things down. And it made for a very frustrating experience for players. Ultimately, once they got to 8 p.m., they decided they were going to wipe out all of the scores for the third round for the players who completed it and for the ones who didn't, and that the decision would be the tournament would be a 36-hole event. The committee said in a release to Golf Channel, quote, throughout round 3 on Thursday, and despite efforts to improve conditions, which they apparently did try to water the putting surface, it became apparent that the pin placement on hole number 6 was unplayable. After play was suspended due to lightning late Thursday afternoon, the committee analyzed numerous different options on how to complete the tournament in the time allotted, end quote. And again, you can go to Brent Lee's Twitter, it's Brent Lee GC, and you can see this video for yourself. I'm not going to pull it because it's his stuff, but it's infuriating to watch competitive golfers in their national championship being embarrassed like this because of this whole location that just was not right, just not fair. And to leave 40% of the field unable to finish the round. I flipped it earlier. 40% were unable to finish the round because of how slow this type of pin location made things. And there are a couple other tricky holes out there that can be tough to play. But there were plenty of videos that were shared showing tons of putts just getting just to the cup or just over, and then they come back, the players' feet, and the players are putting their putters over their heads, frustrated, and they should be. But what happened is the NCAA, who is responsible for setting these pins, put a pin in a bad spot, and they let it go on all darn day, and then this stuff started to trickle out, hit social media, because I'm sure players and coaches were equally frustrated by this decision, made it public, and then all of a sudden the NCAA had a quagmire on their hands because about half the field couldn't finish, and they were all playing poorly on this particular hole, and their decision to make the pin location what it was created this problem. They had no other choice but to invalidate all of the scores for that round, declare it a 36-hole tournament, and be done with it. They could have given par, I guess, to every player, but 40% of them didn't finish. So you would have had to have them come back and finish the tournament that way, and you'd just have them play 17 holes, which I think is pretty ridiculous as well. But in the end, and GolfStat is a great place to look this up. They do a lot of the scoring for college tournaments. They had live scoring for this. That at the time they showed the number 6 hole as playing more than a shot and a half over par. There were 29 others, which means triple bogey or worse, and somehow 5 birdies. And one coach said to Golf Channel, I saw 2 of the birdies. One would have gone 25 yards off the green if it didn't go in. It's just crazy, and it's sad. It's really sad, because decisions like this, and they happen at every level of golf, but decisions like this, particularly in a national championship for collegiate players that are most likely not going to be professional golfers. Like, this is the pinnacle of their golf achievement. And to have that just stripped away from them in embarrassing fashion because of frankly, a very poor choice in setup. And I'm sure the folks at Mission Inn would have said, hey, maybe you shouldn't put that pin there. It's going to be pretty rough. And someone overlooked that and still did it anyway. Stinks. I wish they didn't do it. And it's a bummer that this works out this way. But I wanted to bring that to your attention because sometimes stuff like that happens. And you just need to tell somebody that something crappy happened and get mad about it for a second and hope it doesn't happen again. But we've seen this happen in high school tournaments, other amateur events. Sometimes people just make a bad mistake. And that the NCAA waited until 8 o'clock that night when they knew the round wasn't going to finish, and they knew the scoring was what it was, and they knew the social media reaction was what it was. I think that's irresponsible and wrong. Get out in front of it. realize you made a mistake, and do something quickly. That's how you fix problems. That's going to do it for us for today and for the week on 2 Off the First. We'll be back on Monday with another show. We'll go over the AT&T Byron Nelson, which no one seems to really care about. The Sudal Open on the DP World Tour. We've got the Cognizant Founders Cup on the LPGA. We've got a major, the Regions Tradition on the Champions. We've got LIV Golf Tulsa. Pretty stacked week of golf, if I say so myself. So hopefully you enjoyed this weekend. Get to play a little golf yourself if you're doing so. If not, we'll see you back here on Monday to talk about it all with you. If you're listening on a podcast, thanks for doing so. Give us a 5-star review. Leave us a comment. Helps us reach more people. If you're watching on YouTube, smash that subscribe button. Hit the like button. Leave a comment. We appreciate that too. If you're watching or listening through some other fashion, thank you for taking some time of your day to listen to what we have to say about golf and join the conversation. We'll be back on Monday. Have a great weekend, everybody. See you next time on 2 Off the First.